The autumn sun cast a golden hue over the streets of downtown Boston as Emily Carter, 34, stepped out of the car in front of Atlantic National Bank. She wore gray sweatpants, a soft blue t-shirt, and well-worn sneakers, not the attire most would expect from the founder of a successful educational foundation. But Emily had never been one to dress for appearances. What she wore didn't matter nearly as much as what she stood for: dignity, humility, and a relentless drive to help children who'd been overlooked by the system. Walking beside her was James Carter, 42, her husband of 15 years. Clad in a tailored navy suit with a subtle platinum watch peeking from his cuff, he looked every inch the business magnate he was. As the CEO of Carter Capital Partners, James had quietly built one of the nation's most respected investment firms. Yet there was no arrogance in his stride. If anything, the way he gently offered Emily his arm as they approached the marble steps said more about him than any Fortune 500 profile ever could. "You sure you want to go in alone?" James asked, checking his watch as a soft breeze tugged at his tie. Emily smiled up at him, her eyes reflecting both affection and quiet confidence. "I've always handled the foundation's affairs myself, remember? That was the deal." He nodded, respecting her independence. From the very beginning, their relationship had been built on mutual trust, shared values, and a deep commitment to using their resources for good. Despite their vast wealth, homes in Martha's Vineyard and Aspen, private jets, access to power circles, Emily had insisted on keeping her life simple. She drove a modest hybrid, volunteered on weekends, and ran her foundation out of a small brick office in Cambridge, with mismatched furniture and shelves of worn children's books. The Carter Educational Foundation had started with a simple mission to help kids who couldn't read. Over the years, it had grown beyond anyone's expectations, reaching over 10,000 children across the country through literacy programs, tutoring, and parent workshops. Today's visit to the bank wasn't routine. They usually handled financial matters electronically. But the opening of a new initiative meant establishing a separate account. It required in-person documentation, and Emily insisted on doing it herself. "I'll take that call from Singapore in the lobby while you go ahead," James said, gesturing toward the glass door. "Won't be long," she replied, giving his hand a quick squeeze. As they stepped inside, the contrast between them couldn't have been more obvious. Bank employees straightened at the sight of James's suit. Emily, in her casual clothes, barely earned a glance. But that never bothered her. She wasn't there to impress, she was there to make a difference. And what happened next would prove that appearances can be deeply deceiving. The cool rush of air conditioning greeted Emily Carter as she stepped through the towering glass doors of Atlantic National Bank. Marble floors gleamed beneath her sneakers, reflecting the ornate brass fixtures and hushed elegance that marked this as a bank for Boston's elite. A place where tailored suits outnumbered smiles, and the lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and lavender oil diffusers. James gave her a reassuring nod before stepping aside to take his international call. As the CEO of Carter Capital Partners, he was used to juggling billion-dollar decisions in time zones. Even so, his eyes lingered on Emily with a trace of hesitation. He knew she was capable, brilliant even, but he also knew how this kind of place could treat someone who didn't look the part. Emily walked toward the customer service counter with a thick folder tucked under her arm. Inside it was everything the bank had requested: IRS certification of her nonprofit status, ID documents, board authorization letters, and a $250,000 check drawn from the foundation's fundraising gala. It had taken months of planning, coordination with donors, and community outreach to raise that money. Every cent of it was meant to fund a new reading program for children who had fallen behind during the pandemic. Behind the polished mahogany desk sat Linda Hayes, the customer service manager. Mid-40s, blonde, sharp features, and dressed in a crisp white blouse with a pearl necklace resting just above her collarbone. She looked like someone straight out of a corporate training brochure, but her eyes, despite the professional exterior, flickered with something else when she saw Emily approach. "Good morning," Emily said with a polite smile. "I'd like to make a deposit and open a new account for my foundation." Linda's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Do you currently bank with us?" "No, this would be a new relationship," Emily replied, placing the folder on the desk. "The Carter Educational Foundation is launching a new literacy initiative, and we need a dedicated account for tracking and reporting." Linda flipped open the folder and her expression shifted when she saw the check. 6 figures, clean and clear. But instead of proceeding, she narrowed her eyes. "That's quite a sum," she said, her tone dipping into something less friendly. "May I ask where these funds originated?" Emily maintained her composure. "The money was raised through our annual benefit gala. We've been operating for 5 years, serving over 10,000 children across the country. All documentation is included." Linda barely glanced at the paperwork. She looked instead at Emily's clothing. Soft cotton, athletic shoes, no designer logos, no jewelry aside from a modest wedding band. To Linda, Emily looked more like someone who'd wandered in from a morning jog than a serious financial client. "I'm not sure this is the right banking relationship," Linda said, her voice louder now, drawing curious glances from other clients. "Atlantic National caters to a high net worth clientele. People who handle transactions of this size don't usually dress like that." Emily felt the flush rise in her cheeks, but she stood tall. She knew who she was. What she didn't yet know was that the next few minutes would not only test her dignity but ultimately change the course of the entire institution. Emily Carter stood frozen for a moment, unsure if she'd heard correctly. The hum of hushed conversations and the faint tapping of keyboards filled the air, but it was as if all sound had drained from the room. Across the desk, Linda Hayes sat with folded arms and a condescending smile, her voice now firm and louder than necessary. "I'm just saying," Linda continued, "a $250,000 deposit from someone not previously in our system and dressed the way you are, well, it raises questions." Emily could feel the eyes. Bank clients paused mid-signature. A young teller behind the counter shifted uncomfortably. A woman waiting nearby looked over her glasses with barely disguised curiosity. It wasn't just embarrassment anymore, it was humiliation, and it was public. Trying to stay composed, Emily responded with measured calm. "All the necessary documentation is here. Our CFO confirmed the process with your office last week. Everything is legitimate." Linda leaned in slightly, lowering her voice, but only enough to make her judgment carry farther. "Look, Mrs. Carter, or is it Miss? Either way, people who deal in that kind of money usually arrive in something other than gym clothes. It's not just about the paperwork. It's about who we are as an institution." Emily clenched the folder a little tighter. "Are you refusing to open the account?" "I'm suggesting," Linda said, pointing a well-manicured finger toward the exit, "that you might have better luck at a different institution, somewhere that serves your kind of clientele." It was a subtle phrase, but it landed like a slap. Emily's cheeks flushed with heat, not from shame, but from disbelief. She had always known that people could be judged based on appearance, but rarely had she experienced it so blatantly, so unapologetically. From across the lobby, a security guard casually glanced over, sensing the rising tension. 2 more customers looked up from their seats, watching the drama unfold with the same morbid fascination people reserve for slow-moving car accidents or courtroom outbursts. "I can call security if necessary," Linda added, loud enough for half the lobby to hear. That was the breaking point. Emily's posture stiffened as she fought to control her breathing. She hadn't walked into that bank expecting to be celebrated, but she certainly hadn't expected to be treated like a criminal. She was a wife, a mother, a philanthropist, and someone who had spent the better part of a decade helping kids learn to read. Kids who otherwise would have been left behind. And now, in one of Boston's most prestigious financial institutions, she was being dismissed like an uninvited guest at a country club. As the color drained from her face, she quietly uttered, "You're making a mistake." Linda smirked. "Not the first time. I've had to protect this bank." Just then, the glass doors opened again, and in walked James Carter. He wasn't smiling. The moment James Carter stepped back into the lobby of Atlantic National Bank, he felt it. Something was wrong. He had just finished a high-level conference call with investors in Singapore, but the strained look on Emily's face across the room wiped every number and market forecast from his mind. She stood rigid, clutching a folder against her chest. Her shoulders, normally relaxed and composed, were now tense. The woman behind the desk, Linda Hayes, though James didn't yet know her name, was leaning forward, one hand gesturing toward the exit in a way that was far from welcoming. James didn't rush. That wasn't his style. Instead, he walked deliberately across the marble floor, each footstep echoing with a weight that seemed to draw attention. One by one, heads turned. The security guards straightened. A pair of tellers whispered. A manager in a side office peeked through the glass. James had been in countless boardrooms, testified before congressional panels, and closed multi-billion-dollar deals. But what he was about to do mattered more than any of that. As he approached, he caught the tail end of Linda's sentence, "Not the kind of client this institution is designed to serve." That was enough. "Excuse me," James said, his voice calm but firm, the kind that carried across a room without ever rising in volume. "Is there a problem here?" Linda turned, clearly annoyed at the interruption, until her eyes landed on the perfectly tailored navy suit, the platinum watch, the unmistakable presence of someone powerful. She faltered. I'm handling a situation with this woman," she stammered, pasting on a customer service smile. "Perhaps someone else can help you while I finish up here." James stepped beside Emily and placed a protective hand on her shoulder. His voice dropped an octave. "You're handling a situation with my wife." The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a paperclip drop. Linda's face blanched as the pieces began to click into place. Emily's last name, the six-figure check, the poised confidence despite the casual clothes. And now the man standing beside her, James Carter, founder of Carter Capital Partners, a name that echoed through the banking world like royalty. "Your wife?" Linda repeated, eyes darting between them. "Yes," James said evenly. "Emily Carter, founder of the Carter Educational Foundation. The check she's holding is from our benefit fundraiser, one that brought together over 300 donors to support literacy programs across the country. She's here to open an account for our new reading initiative." Linda's mouth opened, but no words came out. Across the lobby, a young associate took a step back, realizing he'd just witnessed a professional disaster in real time. Every nearby customer was now watching not with amusement, but with growing discomfort. The atmosphere had shifted from curiosity to reckoning. James turned to Emily. "I'm sorry I let you go in alone," he said softly. Emily shook her head. "I needed to see it for myself." And together they stood, side by side, against a system that had just revealed its deepest flaw, judging worth by appearances, not by character. For a long moment, no one moved. The name James Carter hung in the air like a thunderclap. The hum of business as usual had stopped. Even the rhythmic tapping of keyboards had gone silent. Linda Hayes, still standing behind the polished customer service desk, looked as if the air had been knocked out of her. Her voice, once so firm and judgmental, had shrunk to a fragile whisper. I didn't realize," she stammered, fumbling for words. James didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His calm, deliberate tone was far more effective than any outburst. "And that," he said, locking eyes with her, "is the problem." He turned to face the growing crowd of employees and customers who had witnessed it all. Every dismissive glance, every insinuation, every word that had belittled a woman simply for not fitting the image of what someone thought wealth should look like. "My wife was treated like a fraud," James continued, "not because of her behavior or her credentials or even the size of her deposit, but because of how she was dressed, because someone assumed she didn't belong." From the mezzanine level, a tall man in a dark gray suit had been watching. Richard Bennett, the bank's president, had recognized James the moment he stepped into the building. What he hadn't expected was to find himself walking into the aftermath of what could only be described as a PR catastrophe. He descended the steps quickly, clearing his throat as he approached. "Mr. Carter," Bennett said, offering his hand with a practiced smile. "This is certainly an unexpected visit." James accepted the handshake, but didn't return the smile. "Unfortunately, it's not under the best of circumstances. My wife Emily came here today to open a new account for our foundation. She brought the proper documents, a verified check, and a mission to help children read. What she received instead was humiliation." Bennett's expression shifted. He glanced at Linda, who now stood pale and still, her hands folded tightly in front of her. The message was clear. This was no small customer service mishap. This had become a moment of reckoning. "I'm deeply sorry," Bennett said. "There's no excuse for what happened. It does not reflect our values." Emily, quiet until now, stepped forward. Her voice was soft, but it carried a quiet strength that silenced even the clicking of heels on the marble floor. "With respect, Mr. Bennett," she said, "this wasn't just one person's mistake. It was a reflection of a culture, one that assumes people must look a certain way to be taken seriously. If I had walked in wearing designer heels and carrying a Louis Vuitton bag, would any of this have happened?" Bennett didn't answer right away. His silence said everything. "We've banked with Atlantic National for over 15 years, James added. "We've directed dozens of clients here, but this makes us question whether we've placed our trust in the right institution." As murmurs spread through the lobby, Bennett stood straighter. "I understand," he said, "and I promise you this will be addressed not just today, but moving forward." The look in James's eyes made it clear he wasn't interested in promises. He wanted accountability, and this time the bank would have to deliver it. 3 days later, Emily and James Carter sat across from Richard Bennett, president of Atlantic National Bank, in a quiet conference room adorned with framed photographs of Boston's historic financial district. The tone of the meeting was different now, more somber, more reflective. Richard, once the composed executive, looked humbled. He'd had time to review every detail of the incident. He'd spoken to staff. He had even reviewed surveillance footage. But none of that carried the same weight as the words Emily had spoken in the lobby. "Would this have happened if I looked the part?" "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," Richard began, clasping his hands in front of him, "first, I want to thank you for returning. I wouldn't blame you if you had chosen to move all your accounts elsewhere. But your presence here tells me you're open to something more than an apology." James nodded, his expression serious. "We're here because we believe in accountability, not just for people, but for institutions. And right now, your bank has an opportunity to show it values something more than marble floors and designer suits." Emily leaned in. Her voice was soft but direct. "This wasn't about one person. Linda Hayes acted on assumptions that likely go unchecked in places like this all the time. What if I had been someone with only a few $100s to deposit, someone putting in their life savings? Would she have been treated the same or worse?" Richard swallowed hard. "You're absolutely right." That conversation sparked a change. Not a public relations campaign, not a carefully worded press release, but a real structural change. In the weeks that followed, Atlantic National Bank announced a bold new initiative, the Community Banking Partnership Program, designed to bridge the gap between traditional financial institutions and underserved communities. The program prioritized nonprofit organizations, small businesses led by women and minorities, and individuals who often felt overlooked by polished, high-rise banking environments. But that was just the start. Every employee, from branch managers to entry-level tellers, would undergo bias awareness and empathy training, led in part by the Carter Educational Foundation. The goal wasn't just to avoid another incident, it was to transform how people were seen and treated the moment they stepped through the doors. To lead the community outreach component, the bank promoted Michael Chen, a young associate who had quietly stepped up during Emily's initial visit. His personal connection to the foundation, his younger sister Lily had once struggled with reading until Emily's program changed her life, gave him both purpose and perspective. The change was not cosmetic. Posters in the bank now highlighted local community partners, brochures offered financial literacy tips, not just mortgage rates, and new accounts were being opened by people who had previously believed that banks like this weren't meant for them. Emily and James didn't just witness the shift, they helped shape it. Because sometimes the most powerful transformations don't begin in boardrooms or behind closed doors. They begin when someone dares to speak up in the face of quiet injustice, and someone else listens. For Linda Hayes, the days following that humiliating afternoon at Atlantic National Bank were a blur of meetings, internal reviews, and long sleepless nights. She had been removed from all client-facing responsibilities. Her once proud position as customer service manager, earned through years of dedication, now felt like a distant memory. But it wasn't just her career that weighed on her. It was the realization of how easily she had misjudged another human being based solely on appearance. At first, she'd tried to justify her actions. She'd told herself she was following protocol, that it wasn't personal. But as she replayed the scene in her mind, the tone of her voice, the way she pointed toward the exit, the look on Emily Carter's face, something inside her cracked. Late one evening, she sat at her kitchen table, staring at a printed article she had quietly clipped from the Boston Chronicle. It was an essay by a 10-year-old girl named Lily Chen, describing how she had learned to read thanks to the Carter Educational Foundation. The words were simple, even childlike, but they cut deeper than anything Linda had heard in a performance review. "My mom and dad cried when I read a book all by myself," Lily wrote. "I didn't feel dumb anymore." What struck Linda most wasn't the story. It was the fact that she had read it before. She had kept the clipping in a drawer, because her own son Matthew had been struggling with reading too. She had hidden that fact from her co-workers, from the PTA, from herself. She had spent so long trying to project an image of success, of control, that she never allowed herself to admit that her own child needed help. The following Thursday, Linda did something she never would have imagined just a week earlier. She walked into a parent workshop hosted by the Carter Foundation. She sat in the back, hands trembling slightly as she listened to Emily speak. Not with judgment or superiority, but with warmth, understanding, and compassion. After the session, Emily made her way through the crowd, answering questions. When she reached Linda, there was a brief pause. "I just wanted to say," Linda began, her voice barely above a whisper, "thank you. Not just for today, but for that moment in the bank. You could have humiliated me in return, but you didn't." Emily gave a soft smile and handed her a brochure. "We all carry battles no one else can see. I hope your son finds what he needs here." Over the next few months, Linda continued attending sessions. Slowly she became involved, not out of guilt, but out of genuine desire to help other parents like her. She volunteered at weekend literacy events, helped organize fundraising luncheons, and even spoke publicly about her own experience. Her fall from grace at the bank had been painful, but it had also been necessary, because for the first time in years, Linda wasn't hiding, she was growing. And sometimes it's the breaking point that finally lets the light in. 6 months later, the world inside Atlantic National Bank looked very different. Gone were the unspoken rules about who looked like a client. Gone were the side glances, the invisible barriers, and the silent assumptions that once dictated who was welcomed and who was merely tolerated. In their place stood something new, something purposeful. Emily Carter stood at the front of a packed auditorium in downtown Boston. Dressed in her usual understated style, simple blouse, jeans, and a silver pendant her son made years ago. She didn't need power suits or bold colors to command the room. Her words did that on their own. Behind her, a large screen displayed photos of smiling children holding their first books, parents in workshops learning how to support struggling readers, and community leaders shaking hands with bankers in small-town branches across New England. These were the faces of change. The true measure of a bank, Emily said, her voice calm but clear, is not in its profit margins or marble lobbies, but in how it treats the everyday person who walks through its doors. Dignity should never be reserved for the well-dressed or the well-connected. The audience, made up of educators, financial professionals, nonprofit leaders, and local families, listened intently. In the front row sat Richard Bennett, the bank president. His face, once tight with corporate caution, now bore the relaxed look of a man who had learned something important the hard way. Next to him was James Carter, his eyes filled with quiet pride as he watched his wife not just speak, but lead a movement. Further back, almost blending into the crowd, was Linda Hayes. She sat with a quiet presence, no longer needing to be the most polished person in the room. In her hands was a folder containing her son Matthew's latest reading assessment. He'd just finished his first chapter book on his own. There had been tears, this time hers. When the presentation ended, Linda approached Emily with a mixture of hesitation and hope. "I think about that day at the bank all the time," she admitted. "Not because of what I said, but because of what you didn't say in return. You gave me space to grow, and I want you to know I've tried to use that chance." Emily smiled gently. "We all have moments we wish we could take back. What matters is what we do with the moments ahead." Outside, the evening sun cast long shadows over a nearby community garden, one of the Carter Foundation's earliest projects. It now flourished with fall vegetables, squash, kale, and late-blooming tomatoes, tended by neighborhood families, including some who had once believed they'd never step foot inside a bank. James joined Emily at the edge of the garden, slipping an arm around her shoulders. "You didn't ask for revenge," he said. "You asked for transformation." "That's always been the goal," Emily replied softly. "Because real change doesn't start with punishment, it starts with possibility." Together they walked along the garden path, not as a billionaire and a philanthropist, but as two people who believe that dignity should never depend on what you wear, what you earn, or where you're from. It should be yours simply because you're human. This story reminds us of a timeless truth. You can't judge a book by its cover. In a world that often prioritizes appearances, titles, and status, we're called to remember that true worth lies in character, not clothing, in compassion, not credentials. For those of us who've lived through decades of change, it's easy to recall moments when we too were judged, or perhaps made judgments ourselves based on surface impressions. But as this story beautifully shows, dignity is not something earned through wealth or style. It's a birthright we owe to one another simply for being human. Emily's quiet strength and her refusal to seek revenge offer a powerful lesson. Lasting change doesn't come from punishment. It comes from offering others the chance to do better. And sometimes, giving someone grace can plant the seed for real transformation, in them and in ourselves. Whether we're leading a foundation, raising grandchildren, or volunteering at the local food pantry, we all have the ability to shape our communities through kindness, respect, and fairness. Because in the end, it's not how much we have, but how we treat others that becomes our legacy.